So, you've been assigned to teach public speaking. It's not essay writing, and it's not theater. We want to make the experience as beneficial for our students as possible. We want them to leave our classroom empowered, inspired, and confident in their skill sets. But who has the time to read research and go to workshops? That's where I come in. My name is Julian, and you're listening to the Public Speaking Educators Forum. This podcast is for educators who teach public speaking. Each week, you'll hear from a fellow instructor who has an interesting trick to the trade to share with you. We are speaking up so that you can help your students to speak up too. Tonight on the forum, we will be speaking with Dr. Philip Dalton. Dr. Dalton is an associate professor of rhetoric and public advocacy at Hofstra University in New York, where he teaches courses in political communication, intercultural communication, and argumentation. He also directs the Center for Civic Engagement at Hofstra. Dr. Dalton is a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, where he completed his doctorate. One area of particular interest to Dr. Dalton over the years has been the teaching of argumentation. Tonight we'll be learning a little bit about some of the assignments he's created that introduce argumentation while providing a practical exercise in speech. Dr. Dalton, welcome to the forum.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, you've obviously been dealing with argumentation now for the last several decades. I know you've been published in some instructional ancillaries that go along with textbooks in public speaking things. So how did this argumentation assignment, or this, I guess we can call it, pathway of argumentation assignments come about?
The assignment that I think caused you to reach out to me was in the second edition of Dan O'Hare, Rubenstein, and Stewart's Pocket Guide to Public Speaking. I was surprised to hear from you that you'd reached out about it, because I'd originally written that as a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma in roughly 1997 or 1998. And it was meant for an accompanying workbook for the public speaking textbook that we use there. The graduate students were solicited for assignments. Not all of them found their way into the book, I understand. And I was the assistant director of forensics that year. So I thought this would be a nice contribution to a public speaking book, is to kind of foster appreciation for argumentation and debate early in an introductory level class. And so this is what I wrote, and it's okay. I'm looking back at it after so many years, and I'm not terrifically thrilled with it, which is to say, I guess, that my approach to teaching argument has evolved considerably since I wrote that.
Okay, that's great. So what is the context that you've used this assignment in over the years? Or more specifically, which courses have you used it in?
I used that specific assignment that you contacted me about one time as a graduate student teaching the introductory level class, the public speaking class. And it dawned on me rather early that the amount of content that was there was outrageous. There's so much that I try to accomplish. So imagine this as a supplementary addition to a workbook that accompanies a textbook. So the bulk of your reading is in the textbook. So picture a professor assigning a student to read a chapter on persuasion, which covers a wide swath of things, and then accompanying that, my little chapter. This was 12 pages in length. Taking a look back on it, it's roughly 500 words per page, so about 24 standard pages. And in that space, I cover stasis theory, species of argument, deliberative stock issues, divisions of controversy, artistic proofs, lines of argument for refutation, and fallacies. So I almost feel like I wrote it to show a professor how much I knew. But I didn't write it from a student's point of view. So How would I use it? I use it as it is suggested. So it's kind of modeled after a public speaking assignment. Here are the expectations of a public speech. I defined for the reader the expectations for them, and then there was a grading sheet, a rubric, and a team of 4 would divide sides, pick a topic, and then take turns arguing it, and then provide summary comments at the end. But if you think about what it is I'm trying to cover there, the sheer amount of content, I've got to believe students who did it were demonstrating that they could, go through the paces, but I wonder how much they walked away with knowing, because there's just so much, and I would imagine it had been gone through so quickly.
That was actually going to be my next question. I think it's amazing that you've been willing to include so much about argumentation in your courses, because clearly it is its own subject area beyond extemporaneous speaking skills. But I feel like some might argue that such an assignment is a bit too heavy-handed for a basic course in public speaking. So how would you advise someone to truncate or maybe abridge this assignment for an introductory level course?
I would revise this assignment, if I were to revisit it, to be a clash between 2 students. Because I'm looking at it with all these years of distance between now and me having written it, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, what are they going to walk away with? What are they going to learn? And the big takeaway from many years of teaching communication studies and some public speaking and a lot of argumentation and debate is that it's in the doing that students do the learning. You can read the books and understand the concepts, I guess, but a lot of understanding really what they mean in context only takes place or happens in the arguing. So I would cut this back considerably, probably to focus on matters of proposition and understanding, or the thesis, understanding what the controversy or disagreement centers around, and then figuring out what the burdens are for those who are arguing. And that would be it, which, by the way, is a lot to accomplish in an argumentation and debate class. So once again, if the question is, with this assignment, what could be accomplished, say, in several sessions, culminating in some sort of performative exercise, it would just have to be reduced a lot, with a clear focus on just a couple of concepts. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. So you've mentioned that the first edition of this assignment was written back in 1997. How has the assignment changed since that time?
These assignments have changed considerably. My approach has changed considerably since that time. I still teach an argumentation and debate class in a fairly traditional sort of way. If and when I teach public speaking, I've retreated considerably from what I tried to accomplish with the assignment that I'd written that we're talking about today. I try to get students to understand what a proposition is. In other words, to find the center of a controversy, and then to understand how evidence relates to it and in what ways. So using stock issues, but I cover that over several periods. And then the assignment in public speaking, there's a persuasive assignment at the end of the term, which for me, I make persuasive and I structure similar to how you might structure a deliberative policy debate. So in a typical policy debate, you'd have problem, cause, solution, or advantages, or you'd substitute different words for the same things. When I teach public speaking, I have a rubric that's pretty fixed, where students argue that there is a problem. They indict the system, and they are graded on the degree to which they emphasize the significance of that problem. So knowing that they have to kind of move their audience out of a place of satisfaction with the status quo or ignorance of the status quo, but to move them to the point of experiencing some dissonance with it so that they desire a change. Then describing a solution, which, again, I think about what students take away. describing a solution is really my biggest difficulty in public speaking, because for a lot of them, just the idea of either finding a solution that already exists or developing one is a huge task. It can be frightening for some students, and always is. Every time I teach it, students kind of grimace a little bit, because they feel like, and I make clear to them, you don't have to solve the world's problems. I strongly encourage them to go out and find someone else's solution for a problem and adopt it, cite it, but adopt it and propose it as their own. So they describe a solution, they propose something, and then I emphasize the value of the advantages, that fourth stock issue, as a place where you get to dwell on all the positive things that will come from the adoption of the solution. So there isn't clash. There is just demonstrating an understanding of how to word these different things in a persuasive statement, to understand how they are distinguished one from the other, and then how to marshal evidence to help support them, and do that with the audience in mind. So that's how I do it. But when I teach argument, not public speaking, when I teach argument, my approach is different, which I'm happy to develop if you want to talk about that.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. I found my way into communication studies through the way a lot of people do, as a debater at Northern Illinois University. I was a political science student. I remained that. I ended up a minor in communication studies, but I found my way onto the debate team. And I guess I had an advantage because I was outspoken, I was assertive, I was more confident than I deserved to be. And so I could, without much difficulty, get up at a lectern and speak and argue and clash. And some of that was some like dumb cockiness, but nevertheless, I felt comfortable there. I found a place there. And so eventually I ended up getting my master's degree there before going to the University of Oklahoma. But I ended up working with one of the friends of mine from that team, Dr. John Butler, and we were both curious about how do you take this content that is very formally taught, as you see kind of outlined in the assignment we're talking about today. There's a lot of content there. How do you take that stuff that in theory is then practiced in a debate class, or could have been practiced in a public speaking class if you were to follow my original assignment, and recognize its place in actual public deliberation, actual public argument, and where do you use some of these ideas? Right? Lawyers do, but how do you advocate and use this stuff, like fallacies? Where do you use fallacies, right? Once undergraduates learn about fallacies, you often find they look at each other and they say, hey, that's ad hominem. And some may feel as though they just mic dropped you because they discovered a fallacy of reasoning. And they don't. It's ultimately determined by the audience. So learning these things doesn't necessarily equate with success in the public performance of debate or controversy. So we wanted to understand that, and that's where our work has kind of, we followed that track. And as you mentioned at the start, we have a book, Public Policy, Argumentation, and Debate, which tries to do that. It's supposed to be like a handbook to advocacy. But we're trying to get students, readers, to understand something they already know. Like they've been arguing since they were young. They learned how to advocate. You know, if a kid wants a cookie, they learn how to marshal arguments, maybe evidence to get their parents to agree to let them have a cookie. And as you get older, that develops. You become more skilled. You don't know the words for these things quite often. You don't know that there are rules for these things because there aren't, only in intercollegiate debate or in formal debate settings or in law, where law is argued, or in other formal deliberative settings. There are rules, but there aren't rules. So you don't know really how to take control over what it is you're doing and how you're doing it, and more of the options that you have, or the effects, meanings, or consequences of some of the turns you might take, or the way you use evidence or choose to reason. So we're trying to get readers to recognize what they already do. We want to teach people to recognize when they're engaged in a debate, and to recognize the kind of debate that they're in. So there is the species of argument, which I made mention of in the assignment that we're talking about. And it's pretty brief. I kind of raced through it. But there's some significance to it, because I think what we're talking about here today, and certainly with the assignment, is deliberative argument, right? Policy argument. There is presumption that the status quo is either it's the devil, we know, or we presume it to be good, or at least the best that we can do, but it's certainly what is known. And then people will advocate to change that. An arguer needs to know which side of that they're on, and that they have some challenges that they have to overcome, right? When I teach persuasion, students, I spend a lot of time on this. I try to get students to understand that there are lots of problems in the world that we're all familiar with, that they exist and that are troubling to us. And we go to bed at night and we sleep like babies. Many of us do. And the challenge of the debater or the arguer, whether it's in a class or if it's out in the world, is to formulate a description of the system as it is, so it's so troubling that the person who would ordinarily go to sleep at night calm and peacefully would have something in the back of their head sitting there saying, this is a problem that I can't square, with my values or my morals. And that's their challenge. But you realize you take that upon yourself when you recognize that you are engaged in deliberative argument. And we're also training people to recognize the nature of the issues involved in those arguments, then the stock issues, problem, cause, solution, and advantages that they're arguing, what they mean, and what demands engaging in those sub-arguments, as we put them sometimes, put on them. So the first thing I was talking about there was the description of the problem, trying to unsettle your audience with some description of the system as it is that is very troubling. You have to emphasize significance. Sometimes, if you know your audience well enough, they're already with you. They know that the problem is there, but how are you going to solve it? What causes it, right? And so you might have to move to that issue. But I think what a lot of students, and this speaks to one of the assignments that we'll talk about in a little bit, students don't often understand that when they're engaged in an argument, they are someplace, to use a spatial metaphor, in this larger argument. So if the argument spans from the problem all the way to the advantages, there's a lot going on in between. And as, say, you were to say something to me that I disagreed with and I engaged you, where is that argument on the larger scheme of this and in this geography of this argument? I hope I'm not getting too abstract here. I'm actually trying to use metaphors to make better sense. But we try to equip students to understand that I engage you in a debate, and I've called sort of to mind the full span of the policy of the debate. And I can recognize or acknowledge where spatially I am in that. Am I arguing, disagreeing about the nature of the problem, the significance of the problem? Am I arguing that you've identified the wrong cause? Am I arguing that how you're going to pay for your solution isn't something, we can't accomplish that? And then we know where we're disagreeing, which I guess gets to matters of stasis, right? We can identify where in that argument we're disagreeing, and then so we know what evidence to use and so on. But if anything I'm talking about here sounds like it's really abstract, and if you have an experience with debate or persuasion, you get it. But if you're a student listening to this, you're like, wow, that's really abstract. And I'm skilled at this, right? I have a lot of background in this, but if my attempts to to talk about this leave people thinking it's abstract, and I'm trying to be as conversational, as accessible as possible. That just goes to show how difficult it is to teach this stuff, right? To shovel 24 pages of content at students with all the content, all the litany of ideas that I tried to provide in that short chapter. It's just too much. So what we do with that book that I mentioned, and how that my teaching of these ideas has evolved, is to break the concepts down by chapter, and then to have students recognize how they're used in argument and in actual public deliberation. So to move it outside of the classroom and have them become critical observers of debate in the public sphere. That's kind of my goal. That's where I've arrived at.
And you kind of touched on this a little while ago, but I wanted to kind of circle back to this. What is the student response to all of this by and large? How do they respond to this content, as well as sort of the expectations that are being placed on them? Because this is obviously, it requires much more understanding of content, more so than just a cut-of-the-mill persuasive speech would.
That's a great question. And, early on as I taught this, and I'd got kind of more as an amateur teacher, go through the motions of teaching. I'd give you the content, and then you'd reproduce it for some rubric or like a test or something like that. I think now you've got to just be more comfortable with knowing that a lot of the appreciation settles in later, even after the class has completed. And I get that a lot. I get that a lot more than I used to, where students return and will comment that, I use this all the time. I use this all the time in business. I use this all the time in public relations. I use these ideas quite often. I use it in law. And you don't... It's like a lot of things. I've got a teenager who says I'll never use algebra, and he'll that's probably be the case until he needs to use algebra. Maybe some of these ideas are abstract and will remain so until they're in a place where they have to be critical of someone's ideas, which we'd all like to believe our students are right away, right now, listening to politicians and people trying to sell them things and so on, that they're highly critical. But I find often that's, you don't get it right away. You don't get the recognition of the value of some of these ideas right off the bat. It's later on. I think early on they feel overwhelmed and they're struggling to satisfy what they think you want, both in terms of understand, like knowing all the ideas and then being able to perform them. It's a lot. And the way I teach, say when I teach argumentation and debate, I split the class in half. So the first half of the semester is covering the content, and then we dive in and debate and team debates. And I realize all that content that they performed really well on the test, they don't really understand how to apply it. So you question how well do they actually know it, right? So they can reproduce it, but like for a test, but can they master it and performance in the class, and then demonstrate a level of knowledge that way? And the answer is often no. I often say to folks that students are ready for their first debate by the time we complete with our fourth debate, which is fine, right? Because that means it's starting to settle in. They're starting to see it. Starting to see where clash is, where the disagreements are, the role that evidence is playing, how people may try to distract them from the central points of an argument. It's the sort of thing you only see in the doing, which is why the performative element of persuasion and public argument, whether it's in oral comm or public speaking, or if it's an argumentation and debate class, is so crucial to our discipline.
So, in the near future, you will be publishing a new book titled Public Policy, Argumentation, and Debate, A Guide for Advocacy. Congratulations on that, by the way. You were kind enough to share 3 of the exercises that will appear in this book, and we will be, of course, sharing those with our listeners on our blog site. But I just wanted to ask, what led to this book being written?
Sure. Again, I write that book with Dr. John Butler, and this is our second edition on this book, and it's changed considerably. What brought us to develop this book and what is unique in it from other books in the field is that it's looking at how to apply this content in actual public advocacy. I am an academic. John Butler he works with unions just outside the city of Chicago. He is, I understand he's a lobbyist. He'll correct me when he hears this if I'm wrong. But he's doing the public advocacy, and I do some of that as well. I work in politics here out on Long Island. But that was the question that we had, right, which is, a lot of rules that we learn when we learn argumentation and debate don't have much value when we're actually debating or advocating, right? A couple of things come to mind. Like we take the idea of presumption. The presumption that the status quo is acceptable or it's the best that we can do, or that like a person who you could indict me, but if you don't have evidence, your case is going to be thrown out, right? Well, take a look at the birther argument with regard to President Obama. People made the argument or assertions that he wasn't born in the United States. Well, they offered no evidence to that. The evidence of that was that no evidence had been provided contrary to that. So the lack of evidence was evidence in that case. Well, if presumption lies with Barack Obama, does that mean he should never respond to the argument? Well, he didn't for a while, but because the conspiracy of birtherism had spun and spun and spun and spun, he eventually had to reply, and then he released his long-form birth certificate from Hawaii. Now, if we're applying the rules of argument to that instance, he should never have had to reply to that until a good argument was made. A good argument meaning there was evidence to support it. But in reality, he had to respond to that. What's another? Well, that's pretty good. But I gave the example a moment ago about fallacies. Right? If I find that you've used that's post hoc ergo propter hoc. Okay, you don't get a button for that, and nobody's going to say, all right, you got me, you won. Argument doesn't work that way. So we learn these things, and we're trying to figure out in this book, we're trying to teach how your understanding of these things can actually help you when you engage other people in various public forums. So what I shared with you are a few assignments which I think reflect that breaking down of what you see in that small chapter in Dan O'Hare's book. So the first assignment that I emailed to you asks readers to identify a public topic or an issue. So, this might be cap and trade. Let's say Congress wants to place a carbon tax on manufacturing and charge them for expelling carbon into the atmosphere. That would be a good issue. Give it a name. Okay, so we identify. We'll call that cap and trade. And describe the problem that folks want to remedy. So what is this problem that cap and trade is about? Because if we only talk about cap and trade, the clash is narrowed down to just should we or shouldn't we, right? Is this a good policy or is this not a bad policy? But moments ago, I was talking about the whole span of the stock issues that are called to mind, that constitute that geography of the larger argument. Cap and trade is just the solution, but there is a description of the problem that ostensibly is a really significant problem that warrants a change, that we can identify the cause to. And once we identify that cause, then we can consider cap and trade as a solution. But seldom do we do that. And a few moments ago, I talked about people been arguing their whole lives. Yeah, that's true. But there are a lot of habits we pick up, right? For instance, somebody says a thing that triggers you, and then you counter what triggered you. But seldom do we think about what has been said to us. How does our response fit in the larger argument of things, or does it legitimize what was said to us in the first place, right? So by understanding that larger span of arguments, we can take some control over how we engage other people. But anyway, back to that assignment. You describe the problem that warrants the proposed solution, name that policy, and then name some of the criticism of the policy. And this is written up in a paragraph, and it is intended to orient the student to understanding that, let's say, articles or things like op-ed pieces or opinion pieces they encounter on the internet or whatever are parts of public arguments. It's almost never the case that out of the blue, an op-ed is dropped in the New York Times or the Washington Post that an editor would even want to publish had it not been for a larger argument, a controversy that was stirring. So what is that? Let's try to identify that, try to get our hands around those things, give names to these controversies, and then figure out where the for lack of better language, the fighting lines, where they are on it. So that's one assignment. Chapter 2 gets a little more detailed and has students identify a proposition. And this is a little trickier, and this has been a difficult assignment. We revisited it when we edited the book, and we made some changes to it, but it's essentially the same. And the point is this: if I read an op-ed piece, and let's say it's about Space Force, in what larger argument does this lie? Let's say the op-ed piece is opposed to Space Force. What is the proposition? Are they just disagreeing with Space Force, like it shouldn't exist? Or is there a problem with the current system and that getting rid of Space Force would solve? Or let's say the editorial they're reading is really narrow and it's somebody just making fun of the president for having created Space Force. What is that doing in that larger argument? It's not doing a whole lot, but it's still doing something. It is undermining the credibility of the person who proposed this, and maybe the president's intentions in the development of it, which it's not a huge thing, but it's an important part, because the credibility of sources, we know, is crucial to somebody being persuasive. So find the editorial, identify the proposition it belongs to. And that's the difficult part, because the op-ed might have a thesis, which very often requires some digging from the reader to find out what that is. But then once I identify the thesis of the piece, where does it fit in the larger argument? So if we go back to the previous assignment that we talked about, I've got this policy. Where does this editorial fit into the larger span of the argument regarding that policy? What function does it serve? That's what one of the things we try to help students accomplish is, I read an editorial, I can disagree with it. Or I can read an editorial and I can recognize how it functions in the larger span of the stock issues of an argument. And that can equip them to understand if they should reply or how they should reply, or even to recognize that, this actually might work in my advantage on my side of the argument. But that perspective can really only be accomplished once you understand the larger span of the arguments of any controversy, policy controversy. And then identify, we're still with assignment number 2, identify which side of the proposition the editorial is on. So we know that a proposition should advocate to change the system. There's an implicit indictment of the system. There's something wrong with the system that needs to be fixed. I read the editorial. The writer says, let's say the writer says the federal government should add more supplement to unemployment checks. So the status quo is people now get a $400 supplement. Maybe we should add an additional $200 to the supplement. Where does this editorial sit on that? Is Is it for the status quo, or is it opposed to the status quo? And then as the student reads further, we move further into the class and into the book, then we understand what burdens they assume by either opposing or supporting the current system. And then the third and last assignment that I shared with you asked students to choose a controversy, whatever public controversy they want to, and then to write a proposition which no one ever has, right? And by that I mean, it is very seldom the case that in public controversies that anyone engaged in it has identified what the proposition is, right? We should listen to President-elect Joe Biden to hear him ever state an explicit proposition that follows the rules of propositions in our textbooks, that advocates for, when he advocates for additional money for it to respond to COVID. He's not going to craft a statement that meets any argument professor's expectations for a proposition. He's going to make assertions here and there. And then as critical consumers of those statements, we can identify what it is he's proposing, some change to the status quo. Equipped with that, and assignment 3 then asks people to identify what the stock issues then, what they are. So I've identified the controversy, I write then a clear proposition, and then I identify from reading, say broadly, the stock issues that apply to it. What are they saying the problem is? What have they identified as the cause of that problem? What are they proposing as the solution? And how are they saying the solution is going to, say, reduce the problems or make them go away? And what reasons do we have to believe that the solutions will actually follow? So, there you see, I think with these assignments, it reflects the kind of the piecemeal approach we've taken, but also a very concrete approach that we've taken. I've moved so much from that original assignment to where we're at now because I just wanted students to understand it, because they understand how it applies in day-to-day living and in their jobs and in public debates and advocacy and that sort of thing.
Well, this has all been very interesting, and I think it's great how practical, and obviously you're giving them a lot of not civic engagement, but definitely civic awareness through all of this. I mean, I guess that comes part and parcel when you're teaching debate. But of course, it's very easy for us to sort of get swept up in a lot of the conceptual textbook aspects of debate. But it's great that you're sort of putting theory to practice here, that you've been able to apply it at the introductory level public speaking course, as well as at the upper level argumentation and debate course. And I just want to say thank you. We're just about out of time, but thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through all these different variations of that original assignment. It's interesting to see how it's grown. I guess I'll use the word grown over the years. And I'm very happy to see that we're still including that, because the field of communication, as you know, has largely moved away from performance. Things like debate and oral interpretation, voice and diction, a lot of these things are starting to disappear. In fact, many of them already have disappeared from the communication curriculum for undergrads. So it's great to see that this is still something that you invest so much in, and that the students are responding so enthusiastically to, even though it probably is a bit of a struggle for them to learn in the beginning. But my hat off to you for all the work that you do. And I'd again like to thank you for joining us today. Congratulations on your upcoming book, and I wish you a great spring semester despite all the challenges we have due to the pandemic.
Well, it's my pleasure having been here. And anytime you want to talk about persuasion and argument and debate, I'm happy to pick up the phone and talk again.
Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, we are just about out of time. But before we go, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you, Dr. Dalton, for joining us tonight, for sharing so much about what you've done in the classroom over the years, and the fact that this continues to be an interest in terms of scholarship for you. And I wish you all the best with that. And of course, thank you all for listening to the Public Speaking Educators Forum. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and audible.com. Follow us on Twitter at PSEF Podcast, and be sure to tune in again soon.